of an urgent matter.
Mr. Speaker, I so move. The reason that we have conflict of interest provisions in the Cabinet Manual is so that there is something to prevent personal gain, gain by family, gain by friends, or gain by a political party from the actions of a minister. And it is quite clear to all New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker, that Judith Collins, in her actions in visiting the offices of Oravida in China and holding a dinner with the chair of Oravida and a Chinese government official, has a clear and demonstrable conflict of interest. And it is a failure of leadership from the Prime Minister that today he stood in this House and defended Judith Collins. He stood in this House and the most he could say was that there was a perception of a conflict of interest. There has never, in my time in this House, been a clearer conflict of interest than Judith Collins' role with Oravida. Mr. Speaker, let's work through the timeline of this situation with the National Party and Oravida. Let's be absolutely clear. Judith Collins' husband was appointed to the board of Oravida in October 2012. October 2012. Not long after, Mr. Speaker, Oravida announced its partnership with Sanford's for exporting seafood to China. Sanford's being more than 50% owned by Peter Goodfellow, the President of the National Party. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, some months before that, in July 2012, a delegation was brought to New Zealand from China at Oravida's behest, who met with Peter Goodfellow and described him on the Oravida website as the chairman of the National Party. The beginning signs, Mr. Speaker, of the links between Oravida and the National Party being used to ensure that Oravida benefits. But we have to take one important step back, and that is the 2 days either side of the 2011 election. Because on the day before the 2011 election, Oravida New Zealand Limited donated $1,600 to the National Party. And then, curiously, a couple of days after the general election in 2011, Oravida New Zealand Limited donates $55,000 to the National Party. $56,600 in political donations from Oravida Limited to the National Party. That happens at the end of 2011. The delegation comes in 2012 and meets Peter Goodfellow, and Judith Collins' husband, David Wong Tung, joins the board of Oravida in the end of 2012. Mr. Speaker, early in 2013, John Key is reported playing golf with the chair of Oravida, Mr. Stone Shee. There's a little flurry of activity, and we just find out in the last couple of days, Mr. Speaker, that Stone Shee and John Key have played golf on a number of occasions. So that link is in there as well. Then Judith Collins, who's already made a trip to China in 2012, a trip where she does meet some businesses, and in her trip reports to Cabinet, she talks about the businesses that she meets, something she didn't do after the 2013 visit. But in 2013, Judith Collins seeks approval from John Key to go to China in October 2013. She does that in August 2013. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, at that time, she seeks approval for her husband to also travel to China on that trip in October 2013. We'll come back to that in a moment. Not long after, in October 2013, but before she goes to China, Judith Collins officiates at the official opening of Oravida's offices in Auckland. That is attended by, let's list them, Dame Jenny Shipley, Sir Don McKinnon, Peter Goodfellow, Melissa Lee, Paul Goldsmith, John Banks, Anne Tolley, and of course Judith Collins, who gets the opportunity to cut the ribbon. to cut the ribbon at the opening of the offices of a company that her husband is the director of. And let's be absolutely clear here, Mr. Speaker, there are only 3 directors of this company. Stone Shi, Julia Zhu and David Wong Tung, Judith Collins' husband. There are only 3 directors of this company. So Judith Collins officiates at the opening of the Auckland offices. 3 days later, she receives an invitation to visit the Shanghai offices of Oravida Limited. In that invitation, they say, "We would be honoured for you to visit us in Shanghai on the 23rd of October 2013, quote, during your official trip to Shanghai." So let's be absolutely clear. Oravida knew who they were inviting. They were inviting a minister of the Crown to come and visit them. At that moment, if she hadn't done it at any point up to then, Judith Collins should have declared her conflict of interest. At that moment then, she should have known, frankly, Mr. Speaker, she should go nowhere near the Shanghai offices of Oravida. She should have known straight away that that would give rise to a conflict of interest if she visited the Shanghai office of a company that her husband is the director of and that has donated $56,000 to the National Party. So that's the 9th of October, Mr. Speaker. But then on the 15th of October, mysteriously, David Wong Tung withdraws from the trip to China. All of a sudden, he's not going anymore. But as we now know, Mr. Speaker, when Judith Collins did go to China and did go to Shanghai, she took up that invitation to visit the Shanghai offices. Now, let's deal with a couple of the misleading statements Judith Collins has made about that. She popped in for a cup of tea or a glass of milk, like some sort of Countess homogenised. She shows up at this office and says, "All I'm here for is a glass of milk." That is not true, Mr. Speaker. That is clearly not true. Anyone who has seen the photos on the Oravida website can be absolutely clear. There's a huge line of people who are there to meet Judith Collins. There's a very formal setting on the table. Anyone who's done business in China will tell you these things don't happen by accident. These things don't happen on the hoof. This was a pre-planned, well-organised photo opportunity for Oravida that Judith Collins participated in. Invited on the 9th of October, occurred on the 23rd of October. There is no doubt that that represented 2 clear breaches of the Cabinet Manual. It represented a breach in terms of a minister's job of not endorsing products, and it represented a breach because the minister's husband is a director of the company. The Cabinet Office could not be clearer about the need for ministers to avoid conflicts of interest of that sort, and in that moment, Judith Collins clearly breached both of those. She was there in China on a $36,000 taxpayer trip. $36,000 that taxpayer trip. There are families, Mr. Speaker, in New Zealand who have to live for a year on $36,000, and Judith Collins spends that going to China to promote the business that her husband is a director of. But what we learn today, Mr. Speaker, what we learn today is that was not the extent of it. And Judith Collins has spent the last week minimising everything about this, arrogantly dismissing the concerns of anyone who would raise them, saying there was nothing wrong with what she did. And today we learn that in addition to visiting that company that her husband is a director of, she had dinner with the chair of the company, Stone Shi, and a senior Chinese border control official. Now let's just pause on that for a minute. Let's ask the meat exporters of New Zealand just how difficult it is to get products into China. Let's ask any New Zealand company that exports into China how difficult it can be. So what benefit might there be for Oravida to have a meeting where a Chinese official from the Border Control Agency meets a minister? A minister. Stone Shi can say, look, This is how influential I am. I've got a Minister of the Crown here. Mr. Speaker, I don't think there is much more serious in this story than Judith Collins holding that dinner. And today in this House, Judith Collins told us that there were not any discussions at that dinner about the business activities of Oravida. I do not believe that, and I think that Judith Collins will have to come back to this House to correct that statement, Mr. Speaker. So when we put all of those things together, what we have is a tale of a minister who has quite clearly breached Cabinet Office rules, a minister who doesn't think the rules apply to her. And sadly, that is typical of a National Party who work in the interests of their wealthy friends rather than in the interests of all New Zealanders. And that's what a minister travelling overseas is there to do. Judith Collins said it herself, I'm there to work for New Zealand Inc. No, she wasn't. She was there working in the interests of her family's company and the interests of the National Party's donors. It's the wealthy few who benefit in this country from the National Party, Mr. Speaker. But then we have the reaction of John Key. We have John Key's response to this. A man who told us he would lift the standards of behaviour by ministers. Well, that's not what we've seen. What we've seen is a continuous run under his leadership of poor behaviour by ministers. But today, not like Nick Smith, who had to resign over a letterhead, not like Richard Worth, not like Pansy Wong, Judith Collins gets away with it. And that's because Judith Collins is too powerful in the National Party caucus for John Key to deal with. But today is the low point in John Key's leadership. Today is the day that he failed his own test by not getting rid of Judith Collins. If she doesn't understand this was a conflict of interest, she is not fit to be a minister. This visit and the endorsement that happened at it benefited Oravida. This visit and the endorsement benefited the directors of Oravida, one of whom is Judith Collins' husband. This visit and endorsement benefited the National Party via donations. That is where we have reached with this national government. It is cronyism, and this minister should resign, and this Prime Minister should be ashamed of himself.
Order. The question is the motion be agreed to. Honourable Bill English.